This is County Historian Larry Tippin. We have been doing a series on some of the small communities in Putnam County. We're going to continue that today in extreme northeastern Putnam County, east of Rochdale, where we have Fort Red, now called Barnard and Wheaton. This is a map, 1864, shows in extreme northeastern Putnam County, Jackson Township, at the corner and intersection of sections 1, 2, 11, and 12, a small school, red school, at the northwest corner of that intersection. And we can see that Calvin Barnard owns a significant amount of the land north of that intersection. Go to the 1879 Atlas and Historical Record of Putnam County. We now see a Fort Red post office and cemeteries marked schoolhouse number 5. The cemetery was not marked in the 1864 that we just viewed, but the first burial started about 1837. We also see a store, a post office, and then we see close-up in 1874 to highlight some of the towns and communities. We see school number 5, Dr. Rogers' office, drugstore, and a store and post office, Benjamin Franklin Wilson, at Fort Red. If you want to see what it looks like now on a current map, you can see that Fort Red is east of Rochdale, about 6 miles, at the intersection of US 236 and County Road 825 east. Fort Red was laid out by William DeMoss in 1876, but it was never properly platted, or the plat was never recorded. The County Recorder's Office, believed to be named for the red schoolhouse that we saw in the 1864 map. We don't think there was ever a fort or any kind of military installation there. The information we have available indicates that Fort Red was named after the red schoolhouse. Henry Rogers was an early doctor, and then Dr. Nude came to the area in 1894. We learn a lot about these communities by reading the newspapers. Now that we have the Hoosier Straight Chronicles online, which is free and available, we've been able to find a lot more about some of the communities that we did not know before. So on the left is an article from the Greencastle Banner, or the Daily Banner, May 16th, 1878, where it says, on Friday, quite a train of buggies passed through Fort Red, transferring the students and their properties from the Ladoga School to Danville. So when they say train, they didn't mean an actual train, just a large progression of horse-drawn buggies. We didn't have a railroad yet in Fort Red in 1878. And the Ladoga Academy, which had been a thriving institution, decided they were just going to move in the middle of the night to Danville. And that later merged with the Danville Academy and later became the Central Normal College in Danville, an interesting historic school. A lot of the school teachers were trained at the Central Normal College. Then on the right, we see April 10, 1879, where the farmers are busy sowing the oats. Old Mr. Shield has died. Dr. Rogers is teaching a class in vocal music, so we're getting some high class in Fort Red. But at the bottom, we see in April 10, 1879, the contractors are delivering the ties along the line of the Indianapolis, Decatur, and Springfield Railroad. Further, we see in June 19, 1879, All schools were closed for the summer. Wheat harvest is almost here. And then we see grading along the line of Indianapolis, Decatur, and Springfield Road is going on lively. On October 2nd, 1879, the grading is completed and the road is ready. The railroad is ready for the ties to be installed. Also, the correspondence complaining the trustee is not doing enough to help the schools. Back then, the schools were township schools, and it was up to the trustee to provide the funding and resources for the schools. Then on Christmas Day, 1879, we see that Fort Red is going to have a Christmas tree. Christmas was a lot different back then than it is now. The celebration generally started on Christmas Day, as opposed now to when you had shopping and commercial activities leading up to Christmas Day. Christmas would start on that day and continue for 12 consecutive days, and each day they would honor a patron saint, Saint Bartholomew, so forth, ending on January 5th with a celebration called Twelfth Night. Shakespeare wrote a play about it. Then also, on that day, they sang the track for the Indianapolis, Decatur, and Springfield Railroad is laid to the river bridge, and quite a force is working on the bridge. February 7th, they've announced that the trains are going to start running on February 9th. So we know from these articles and other resources, that's the day the railroad opened up, the Indianapolis, Decatur, and Springfield Railroad. They went through northern Putnam County, through Fort Red, Wheaton, Rochdale, Raccoon, and then through Russellville. And then you see on the 19th of February, 1880, they're glad that they can get the goods in and out of Fort Red because of the railroad. Let's talk about Fort Red a little bit. The postmasters, the post office created a post office in Fort Red even before the railroad came, with William DeMoss, who laid out Rochdale as the postmaster, beginning March 1st, 1876, and several more postmasters. And then on March 29th, 1880, the name was changed to Barnard. When the Indianapolis, Decatur, and Springfield Railroad came through Putnam County, as we saw in late 1879 and early 1880, it missed Fort Red by a quarter of a mile to the north, running right through the farm and the vast holdings of Calvin Barnard. So the railroad named the station in honor of Calvin Barnard, called it Barnard Station. And then for a short time, Fort Red existed with the Barnard Depot. And then the post office was renamed Barnard after the depot. Sometimes a post office is named after the postmaster, or the names change occasionally, but Barnard was never the postmaster. But they renamed the post office March 29th, 1880, with Henry Rogers still the postmaster. And it continued until June 30th, 1912, when the mail then was sent to Rochdale. This is interesting. In the census records, United States Federal Census, in 1880, we see in Jackson Township, they have a separate listing for the village of Fort Red. You see the top of this, cut out the middle of it, we see at the bottom, it says the end of Fort Red, which had 38 citizens at that time. Let's talk about Calvin Barnard then, who the station, the railroad depot, was named after. Calvin Barnard was first in the Fort Worth area by the 1850s. We see him first in the 1850 census, came a few years before that, and also in the 1860, 70, and 1880 census. In 1880, he's listed as being partially blind. He was married 3 times, first to Melinda Williams. Sadly, after Calvin and Melinda had twins, October 6, 1846, Melinda apparently did not recover from that experience, died November 6, 1846, at the age of 32. Calvin then married Catherine Booker in 1848. And then she died in 1871. Then Calvin married for a 3rd time to Lorena Chadwick in 1875. Calvin died in 1885 at the age of 78. He and his first 2 wives are buried at the Barnard Cemetery with at least 6 of the children of Calvin Barnard. Calvin and Lorena Barnard platted out the town of Barnard on July 29, 1881, as we see in Plot Book 3, Part 1, on page 20 in the County Recorder's Office. And this was a plat of Barnard. It was north of the railroad, about a 1/4 mile north of the current US 236. Didn't go through Fort Red. The town of Fort Red was not part of this. A separate town to be called Barnard. You see the lots just north of the railroad and just north of the railroad station. And you see that it was platted July 28, 1881. Calvin Barnard signed it with an X with his mark, maybe because, as we saw in the 1880 census, by then he was partially blind. Let's go back to some more news. We see in 1882 that previous Saturday about midnight, the storehouse owned by Calvin Barnard was discovered to be on fire. And they were not able to get the fire out. The building burned to the ground. And then later, in 1892, this 10 years later, the schoolhouse burned. It's called District School number 5, which was the one in Fort Red, now beginning to be known as Barnard. And they blamed it on a defective flue. And luckily, they had some insurance on that building. That's when I lost schoolhouse number 5, the one that we saw in those earlier maps. So there's an interesting article. In 1896, by now the railroad has been called the Indianapolis, Decatur, and Western Railroad, which took over the Indianapolis, Decatur, and Springfield Railroad just a few years prior to 1896, where 3 desperados have accosted the engineer of the train, where they're beating him savagely. Then they didn't stop until the firemen finally threatened them with a gun. That got them finally to stop. June 16, 1911, we see Albert Schooler has had a very bad accident. He fell climbing over a fence, and an unusual accident. There was a stake that entered the back of his head, his skull. What the doctor knew, who was helped by Dr. Batman of Ladoga, and then some Indianapolis surgeons helped him, and they were able to repair the injury to his skull. And then in 1914, we see 3 counts of illegal sale of liquor by Tilden Riddle, who was selling the liquor out of his store against the law at the time. And then we see in 1923, we're jumping around a little bit time-wise, Clarence Booker, whose farm was near Barnard, had what the county said was the largest still they'd ever uncovered. And he's still on the run, and his wife's left to feed and take care of the livestock. Now we see in 1914, Eel River Heights So Big Walnut Creek was more commonly called the Walnut Fork of Eel River. So apparently along Big Walnut, some of the people that lived up and down Big Walnut in the Fort Red/Barnard area, they called it Eel River Heights. They had about 80 articles in the 1910s and 1920s featuring Eel River Heights. It's kind of interesting. They said that Miss Laura Eggers, who turned 17 this time, was surprised by her father with a piano. Then the young folks, as you see at the bottom, gave her a surprise party. Laura Eggers, not long after this, married Roy Barker, and she lived to be almost 100. Here's a picture of the old Barnard Elementary School, discontinued in 1964. And that building was later torn down. And the bricks were used to construct the brick house on the grounds of the old schoolhouse, which was just east of the church that you still see on US 236 in Barnard. The church is still being used. And then the grain elevator. This is where the depot originally was, called Barnard Station, or Barnard Depot, and then later became a grain elevator, and now it's abandoned, not in use anymore. But I remember going to this grain elevator quite often when my grandfather lived not very far from here, and he had an old Chevrolet pickup with an ultimate anti-theft device, which was a manual transmission on the column, 3-speed on the column as it's called, and virtually no one can operate a 3-speed on the column manual transmission. And I remember him going to get his feed ground, put it in the sacks, come back, and go across the Big Walnut Bridge and come up the steep hill. They went through all the gears. It didn't look like the truck was going to make it. And finally, when it's on, it's just about its last little sputter. We crested the hill, finished our trip home. And this is a real neat photo of the Barnard Bridge on Big Walnut, which was washed out in the flood of 1957, we believe. And this is a really interesting map. We look at a lot of different maps to do our research. And this is one that was the mail routes about 1910, probably closer to 1912, where we see Barnard. And then a little bit west of that, on the way to Rochelle, on the Indianapolis, Decatur, and Western Railroad, was a community called Wheaton. It even shows the postmasters, people that you would expect, Eggers, Blades, Booker, for the postmasters. And this is a very important map. That actually answered a lot of questions for us. We're going to talk about that just a little bit. And you can see where the homes were and the schools and so forth at that time. Okay, let's talk about this Wheaton. Maybe where they put the wheat on the train. This is from the Atlas, Putnam County, 1879. The railroad is just not quite there yet. So it went through about where the arrow is. And then you see that there's 2 cemeteries there. One, the Dean family cemetery, with about 25 or so burials, and then a smaller family cemetery. We see Abner Fields, an esteemed sawmill of Jesse Eggers. And then, very interesting, this is County Road, the current County Road 650 East, where it met US 236, southwest corner. There is a church and a school, school number 6, in 1879. Let's talk a little bit about the founding of Wheaton. Said John Dean of Harrison County, Kentucky, took out the first land patents in Section 4 in the area that was to become Wheaton in 1831. Land patent would be the first deed from the United States government to the first early settlers. Then we see them in the census in 1840 in that area. And John Dean married Harriet Ann Kern or Current. They typically wrote it down the way it sounded, so her name was actually several different ways. About 1833 or 1834, they had about 10 or 12 children, of whom 4 are buried at the Dean Cemetery. One of their sons, John Thomas Dean, was born in 1835 and married Maria Cox in 1856. And they had about 10 children, of whom 5 were buried in that Dean Cemetery at Wheaton. And Wheaton had a post office, not surprisingly, after the railroad came through. That's when the community really started to grow. There was never a whole lot there. There was a general store and a few scatterings of houses. But they only had 2 postmasters, James Moreland and then Abner Fields in 1881, who was a postmaster until all the way until 1904 when they discontinued the post office. And then you would get your mail at Rochdale if you lived in that community. Here's a couple of neat pictures of schools. This is from a publication called Schools in Your Hand, published by the retired teachers of Putnam County in 1978, where they have a photo of the Egger schools, at that time used as a granary. It just recently has been taken down. It deteriorated to the point that they went ahead and took it down. But it was on 650 East, southeast of Wheaton, a mile south of US 236. The story behind this is school number 6, which is at the intersection of 650 East and US 236, we believe burned to the ground just after 1900. And then Jesse Eggers donated the land to build a new schoolhouse number 6 on his farm, so his kids wouldn't have to walk so far to get to school. But if you know anything about that area, that mile or so south of US 236 on 650 East, drifts very badly. So another school was built. This one was just a little bit southwest of Wheaton on 236, still in use. You can still see that hand pump in the front. It's a private residence now. So they built this school probably because the kids couldn't get to the new schoolhouse 6 from Wheaton because of all the drifting and the snows. That's why we had 2 different schoolhouse number 6s. And then just a little bit west of that was the Leavening School, which is school number 7, which is at the end of the Lebanon Road, which intersects 236, just east of the Rochdale Cemetery. As a matter of fact, the Rochdale Cemetery originally was called the Lebanon Cemetery because it was at the Lebanon Road. Let's go back to some of the news. In 1894, we just see a scattering of news from Wheaton. We have the Deans, the Morelands, Wilson Lee, who is a prominent citizen of the area. Miss Minnie Goff is teaching the school, and the pupils have fallen in love with her. She's learning rapidly. And then you see the correspondence is mysterious XYZ, success to the Star Press and democracy. And then we see some news from North Jackson, which is the Wheaton area, in 1909, where we see Mrs. Rebecca Malaire. They live about 2 miles south of Wheaton and also about 2 miles north of New Maysville. Is improving from her illness. Abner Fields is building a new house. Frank Malaire is visiting his brother John Malaire, who's the husband of Rebecca Malaire, and then some other noteworthy citizens of that area, 1909. So let's go back to this mail route. So we see these schools noted. The school 6 is called, and then this other school which is the other School 6, I guess, and then School 7 at the end of the Leavening Road. There's all cemeteries about where the word Rochdale is, or about where the E at Rochdale really started out, and then it moved in this direction. You still see Wheaton and Barnard. And then, even though the school's gone, there's a church here at the southwest corner, the intersection of what's now US 236 and County Road 650. You can see the word friendship. So that rang some bells, and we're able to do some more research, got some more questions answered just because we saw that word friendship on this map. See, in 1894, news from Wheaton. It says that Elder Levi T. Buchanan of New Maysville and Abner Fields are preaching at the Friendship Church last Sunday in Wheaton. We also see in November of 1894, where a visiting preacher had been to Palestine, which is between Groveland and Bainbridge on what we call the old US 36, and then to Friendship Church in Jackson Township. See the news from Wheaton. So the correspondent, this XYZ, was so busy last week because they were attending the association meeting, which is held in the Grove near Friendship Church, which was largely attended. Estimated between 3,000 and 5,000 people were there, but it rained on Thursday morning. And then in the final worship meeting was conducted in the church, which only about half the crowd could gain access. So I'm not sure they're talking about half the crowd of 3,000 to 5,000 because that church was nowhere near that big. But that gives us a lot of good information about the Friendship Church at, a little bit south and east of Wheaton. And then over here on the right, continuing with that article, we'll see on Saturday night, Harv Jeffrey's horse had kicked Mrs. Henry's horse in the leg, breaking it so badly that horse had to be taken down. And here we get through some other prominent citizens. Dodds, Melissa Russ, McLeod, Dean, yours for Silver and Bryan. So this is a political year, 1896. Apparently the XYZ correspondent is a supporter of Bryan. Okay, now we see December 20th, 1895. They're sad to announce the death of Wilson Lee, one of the most prominent citizens of Wheaton, who died December 19th of 1895. His funeral was conducted at the Friendship Church by Elder Thomas, and their remains are buried at the Dean Cemetery. And I made a list of the burials at the Dean Cemetery, and you see, we see a lot of the Deans: Wilson Lee, Margaret Russ Lee. So the Russ married into the Deans and then married into the Lees. And all these other people, I believe, are related to the Dean family. Finally, we're going to talk about the 1879 Atlas and History of Putnam County on page 10. It says the regular Baptists organized a congregation in 1832 with the present church buildings located at the farm of Jesse Acres. We're talking about that building that the one map identified as the Friendship Church besides school number 6 at southwest of the intersection of US 236 and 650 East. So that's how we know that Friendship Church, which is one of the first churches in the area, and where it was located. That's very interesting information.